You won't know the difference anyway." The words landed flat and certain, the way a man speaks when he has never once been wrong in his own mind. Dale Pruitt said them loud enough for the other customers in the waiting area to hear, loud enough for the two teenagers near the vending machine to look up, loud enough for the woman by the window to stop scrolling her phone. He said them with a small smile, the kind that does not invite a response, and he turned back toward his service desk as if the conversation had already concluded. The man standing on the other side of that counter had not moved. He stood with his hands visible at his sides, his shoulders relaxed, his face carrying the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of answer. His name was Calvin Reese. He was 44 years old. He was wearing a plain gray jacket over work clothes, and there was nothing about him, nothing in his posture or his expression that suggested what Dale Pruitt had just set into motion. The waiting room stayed quiet. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward the counter. The teenagers looked at each other and looked away. The woman by the window went back to her phone. The silence was its own verdict. What Dale Pruitt did not know was who he had just said those words to. He did not know what Calvin Reese had spent 22 years building, quietly, without announcement, without a single certificate hung on a wall. He did not know what was about to happen in his own parking lot. And when the truth came out, it cost Dale Pruitt everything he had built his name on. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get to that parking lot, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Calvin Reese really was and why those 5 words were the most expensive thing Dale Pruitt ever said. Now, here's what most people didn't know about Calvin Reese. He grew up in the 9th Ward of New Orleans, in a narrow house on Desire Street where the floorboards hummed in summer heat, and the smell of motor oil was as familiar as the smell of his grandmother's red beans on a Friday afternoon. His grandmother, Estelle Reese, was a small woman who wore her hair pinned back and her opinions close, and she had one saying she returned to whenever Calvin brought home a report card, a trophy, a newspaper clipping, anything that asked to be celebrated too soon. "Stay low," she would say, pressing the paper flat on the kitchen table as if she were ironing it. "Build high. The ones who shout from the bottom never reach the top." Calvin had heard it so many times that it stopped sounding like wisdom and started sounding like weather. Constant, reliable, true. He was 11 years old the first time his uncle, Raymond Reese, let him hold a torque wrench. Raymond ran a one-bay shop off Claiborne Avenue, nothing on the sign but his name and a phone number, and he worked alone 6 days a week in a space barely large enough for the car and the man repairing it. He did not explain much. He demonstrated, and then he watched, and then he handed over the tool. Calvin learned that way, through repetition and silence and the specific satisfaction of a bolt seated exactly right. He learned to read an engine the way some children learn to read music, by feel first, by theory second, by the sound a thing makes when it is working the way it was designed to work. By the time he was 16, Calvin was doing full brake jobs on his own. By 18, he had rebuilt his first transmission, a 1987 Chevy half-ton, in Raymond's driveway over a long weekend, using a manual he had checked out from the public library and a set of tools he had purchased one piece at a time from a pawn shop on Magazine Street. He did not tell anyone. He finished the job, returned the manual, and drove the truck around the block twice to confirm the shifts were clean. He moved in silence. He built in silence. After high school, Calvin did not go to university. He went to work. He spent 3 years at a dealership in Metairie, then 2 years with a fleet company that maintained delivery trucks across 4 parishes, then a decade with a specialty shop in Houston that handled high-performance and vintage engines, the kind of work that required not just mechanical knowledge, but a precise understanding of metallurgy, tolerances, and the particular personalities of engines that had been modified beyond their original specifications. He earned 2 industry certifications during those years. He earned a 3rd in diesel systems. He earned a 4th in automotive electrical. He kept all 4 certificates in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in his apartment, because Estelle Reese had taught him that the work was the proof, and the proof did not need a frame. He was not rich. He had savings, a modest amount, accumulated over years of living simply and spending carefully. He drove a 1994 Buick LeSabre that he had purchased for $800 and maintained himself with the same attention he gave to every machine he touched. The car was 29 years old and ran with a quietness that mechanics at dealerships sometimes stopped to notice. He kept it that way on purpose. He had moved to Carterville, Georgia, 14 months before the morning at Pruitt's Auto Service. He had come for a reason he kept private, as he kept most things private, and he had been working contract jobs in the area, nothing permanent, while he decided what came next. He was not a man who rushed decisions. He was a man who waited until he understood a thing completely before he acted on it. And that is who was standing on the other side of Dale Pruitt's service counter. Now, let me tell you about Dale Pruitt and the world he had built around his own certainty. Pruitt's Auto Service sat on a wide commercial strip on the east side of Carterville, between a tire warehouse and a fast food franchise, and it had been there for 19 years. Dale Pruitt had inherited the building from his father, expanded the service bays from 2 to 6, added a waiting room with a television and a coffee machine, and built a customer base that was loyal in the particular way that people are loyal to a place when they do not believe they have another option. He employed 7 mechanics, a service writer named Gina, and a parts runner named Deshawn, who had been with the shop for 3 years and who knew, in the specific way that quiet employees always know, exactly what kind of place he worked in. Dale was 51 years old, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of confidence that comes not from expertise, but from never having been seriously challenged. He knew engines well enough. He had grown up around them, worked them through his 20s and managed them through his 30s and 40s. But the managing had long since replaced the working, and the distance between what he knew and what he believed he knew had been growing quietly for years. He did not notice the distance. Men like Dale rarely do. What he did notice, and what he had built a certain portion of his business model on, was the difference between customers who knew what they were paying for and customers who did not. He was not the only shop owner who operated this way. He was simply one of the less careful ones about how openly he operated it. When Calvin Reese had pulled the Buick LeSabre into Pruitt's that morning, he had come in for a specific reason. The car had developed a hesitation at highway speeds, a slight stumble under load that Calvin had already diagnosed with reasonable certainty, but wanted a second opinion on, partly out of professional habit and partly because he was new to the area and wanted to understand the local shops. He had described the symptom clearly at the counter. He had used the correct terminology. He had mentioned the RPM range at which the hesitation occurred and the conditions under which it was most pronounced. Dale Pruitt had looked at him across the counter for a moment, then told Gina to write up a diagnostic and take the car back. The diagnostic took 40 minutes. When Dale came out to the waiting room to deliver the verdict, he brought a printed estimate that listed 11 line items totaling $2,340. The estimate included a fuel injector service, a mass airflow sensor replacement, a throttle body cleaning, new spark plugs, a coolant flush, and 3 additional items that had no relationship to the symptom Calvin had described. Calvin read the estimate once. Then he read it again. Then he set it on the counter and looked at Dale and asked, calmly, which of these items were directly related to the hesitation he had described. Dale had smiled, not a warm smile, a patient smile, the kind a man produces when he has decided that patience is the most efficient path to the sale. He explained that modern engines were complex systems, that addressing one symptom often required attending to multiple, interconnected components, that the estimate reflected a comprehensive service approach designed to ensure the vehicle's long-term reliability. Calvin asked again, specifically, which items were directly related to the hesitation? The smile stayed. Dale leaned on the counter and said, in a voice that carried to the waiting room chairs, that he understood it was a lot to take in, but that he had been doing this for 19 years, and that the estimate reflected what the car needed. He paused. He looked at Calvin with the particular expression of a man who has already decided the outcome of the conversation. And then he said it. You won't know the difference anyway. The waiting room went still. Gina, behind her desk, stopped typing. Deshawn, who had just come through the side door with a parts box, stopped walking. The 2 teenagers by the vending machine looked up. The woman by the window lowered her phone. Calvin did not raise his voice. He did not move from where he was standing. He looked at Dale Pruitt for a long moment, the kind of moment that has weight to it, and then he said, quietly, that he would need his keys back. Dale's smile did not waver. He said that was fine, that the diagnostic fee was $95 and that they accepted all major cards. Calvin paid it. He took his keys. He walked out to the parking lot. And it was about to get worse. What Dale Pruitt did not understand, and what he could not have understood from where he was standing, was that Calvin Reese had not walked out of that shop defeated. He had walked out with a decision already made, the kind of decision that does not announce itself, that does not require an audience, that simply begins. Calvin opened the Buick's hood in the parking lot. He stood over the engine for a moment, looking at it the way a man looks at something he has known for a long time, reading it the way Raymond had taught him to read things, from the inside out. Then he walked to his trunk and opened it. He kept a tool roll in the trunk, a canvas roll worn soft from years of use, containing a selection of hand tools he had carried since his time at the Houston shop. He unrolled it on the bumper. He looked at what he had. He thought for a moment. He went back to the engine. Deshawn had come out through the side door to pull a car around and had stopped when he saw Calvin at the hood of the Buick. He was 26 years old, and he had been at Pruitt's long enough to know the difference between a man who was checking his oil and a man who knew what he was doing. What he saw in that parking lot was not a man checking his oil. He stood for a moment. He looked back at the shop door. He looked at Calvin. Then he walked over. You need anything? Deshawn said. He said it quietly, in the register of someone who was not sure whether the offer would be welcome or whether it would cost him something. Calvin looked up. He studied Deshawn for a moment with the same unhurried attention he gave to everything. A half-inch breaker bar, he said. If you got one you can spare for an hour. Deshawn went back inside. He came out 2 minutes later with the breaker bar and a small tray of sockets. He set them on the bumper without being asked and stepped back. He did not go back inside. He stayed. What Calvin Reese did over the next 3 hours in that parking lot was not a performance. It was not a demonstration designed for an audience. It was simply the work, done the way he had always done it, with the tools available and the knowledge he had accumulated over 22 years of doing exactly this. He removed the intake manifold. He pulled the fuel rail. He tested each injector by hand, methodically, checking resistance and the spray pattern with a precision that required no equipment beyond what he carried and what he knew. He found the fault in the third injector, a partial clog that was causing the lean condition responsible for the hesitation, exactly where his initial diagnosis had placed it. He cleaned it. He reinstalled it. He worked through each component in sequence, not rushing, not performing, simply working. A small group had gathered by the time he was an hour in. Not a crowd, but enough people. 2 customers who had come out to their own cars and stayed. A man from the tire warehouse next door who had wandered over during his break. Gina, who had come to the parking lot door and stood in the frame watching without coming out. And Dale Pruitt, who had come to see what the commotion was, and who stood at the edge of the parking lot with his arms crossed, watching a man he had dismissed as ignorant perform work that Dale himself could not have executed with the precision he was witnessing. He said nothing. His arms stayed crossed, but the smile was gone. Calvin finished at 23 minutes past noon. He started the Buick. The engine turned over and settled into an idle that was clean and even and entirely without the hesitation that had brought him in that morning. He let it run for a moment. He listened to it. Then he closed the hood, rolled his tools back into the canvas roll, and placed it in the trunk. He had not said 9 words to the crowd that had gathered. He had not addressed Dale Pruitt once. He had simply done the work. Deshawn was still standing near the car. Calvin looked at him and said, "Thank you for the bar." Deshawn nodded. He looked at the Buick, then at Calvin, and something in his expression had shifted. The particular shift that happens when a person witnesses something they will carry with them for a long time. Calvin got into the car. He put it in reverse. And the parking lot stood in the kind of silence that only arrives when something true has just been demonstrated. But that parking lot was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. Because what Calvin Reese had done in that parking lot on a Tuesday morning in Carterville, Georgia, had not gone unnoticed in the way that most things go unnoticed. It had been witnessed. And witnesses, in the age of phones carried in every pocket, are not the passive things they used to be. The man from the tire warehouse, whose name was Marcus Webb, had stood at the edge of that parking lot for the better part of 2 hours. He had not planned to stay. He had come over on his break out of simple curiosity and had found himself rooted to the spot by something he could not immediately name. The particular quality of attention that Calvin brought to the work. The absolute absence of performance in it. The way the engine responded to hands that understood it. Marcus Webb was 38 years old and had grown up watching his father work on cars in a driveway off Flat Shoals Road in Atlanta, and he knew the difference between a man who knew what he was doing and a man who was pretending. He had not seen anyone work like that since his father. He had taken out his phone 20 minutes into it. Not to film for the internet. Not for any purpose he had consciously named to himself. He had filmed because something in him understood that what he was watching was worth preserving. He filmed for 47 minutes. He filmed Calvin pulling the fuel rail, testing the injectors, finding the fault, cleaning it, reinstalling it with the same unhurried precision he had brought to every other step. He filmed the engine starting. He filmed the idle, clean, and even, settling into a rhythm that was its own kind of proof. He filmed Dale Pruitt standing at the edge of the lot with his arms crossed and his smile gone. He did not post it that day. He drove home that evening, watched it twice on his phone, and sat with it for a long time. He posted it the following morning with a single caption: "Man gets told he won't know the difference. Then he fixes his own car in the shop's parking lot with hand tools in 3 hours." By noon, it had 40,000 views. By evening, it had 400,000. By the end of the week, it had been seen by more than 3 million people, and the name of Pruitt's Auto Service was attached to every one of them. Now, here's what most people watching that video did not know. They did not know Calvin Reese's name because Calvin had not offered it. They did not know his history because Calvin did not speak his history into parking lots. What they knew was what they could see. A man with a canvas tool roll and 22 years of invisible knowledge, working in the open air with a precision that no credential on a wall could have communicated more clearly. The video did not need a caption. The work was the caption. But the caption Marcus Webb had written was precise, and precision, in that particular moment, was enough. The comments arrived in the thousands. Many of them were from mechanics, working mechanics, people who understood what they were watching at a technical level and who used that understanding to name exactly what they were seeing. They named the procedure. They named the diagnostic reasoning. They named the skill level required to execute a fuel injector service by hand, without a scan tool, without a lift, without a parts cannon, in a parking lot on a Tuesday. Several of them were automotive instructors. One of them was a regional director for a national certification body whose name Calvin carried in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet in his apartment. That regional director's name was Patricia Osei. She was 53 years old, and she had been in the automotive industry for 27 years. And she had seen a great many things in those 27 years, but she had not often seen a video that stopped her in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon and made her watch it 3 times in a row. She watched it 3 times, then she looked up the location tag. Then she made a phone call to a colleague in the Atlanta area. The phone call was not about Dale Pruitt. It was about who had been standing on the other side of his counter. And that is where the second story begins. Because there was a man in Carterville, Georgia, who had been watching the video with a different kind of attention than most. His name was Robert Calloway. He was 60 years old and he owned 4 auto service locations across the greater Atlanta corridor, and he had been trying to acquire a 5th location in the Carterville area for 11 months. He had looked at 3 properties. None of them had been right. He was a deliberate man, the kind who did not move until the thing he was moving toward was exactly what he needed, and he had been waiting with the patience of someone who understood that the right thing was worth the wait. Robert Calloway was also a man who had spent his career looking for a particular kind of person. Not the loudest mechanic in the room, not the one with the longest resume or the most plaques on the wall. He was looking for the kind of person who fixed the problem in the parking lot when the shop said it couldn't be done, and who did it without making a speech about it. He had been looking for that kind of person for a long time. He watched the video twice. Then he called his operations manager and said 4 words: "Find out who that is." It took the operations manager less than a day. Deshaun had not been hard to find. He was still at Pruitt's, still running parts, still carrying the weight of what he had witnessed and what he had chosen to do about it in his own small way, which was to hand a man a breaker bar and stay. When Robert Calloway's operations manager called him, Deshaun listened for 2 minutes and then said quietly, "I'll give you what I've got." He gave them Calvin Reese's name. He gave them the make and model of the Buick. He gave them nothing else, because that was all he had. It was enough. Robert Calloway found Calvin Reese through a mutual contact in the Houston automotive community. A shop owner named Gerald Fitch, who had known Calvin for 11 years and who, when asked to describe him, said simply, "He's the best hands I've ever seen, and you'll never hear him say it." Gerald Fitch had said 12 words. They were the right 12 words. Robert Calloway called Calvin directly. Calvin answered on the third ring. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. Calvin did not perform in those 14 minutes. He answered questions directly, without embellishment, and asked 3 questions of his own, each of them precise, each of them aimed at understanding exactly what Robert Calloway was proposing and whether the proposal was serious. It was serious. Robert Calloway did not make proposals that were not serious. What Robert Calloway was proposing was a partnership. A 5th location in the Carterville corridor, built around a service model that prioritized diagnostic honesty and technical precision over volume upselling, staffed by people who knew the difference between what a car needed and what a customer could be convinced to buy. He had been building toward this model for 3 years. He had not been able to find the right person to anchor it. He had watched a 47-minute video on a Wednesday afternoon, and he had found him. Calvin listened to all of it. He asked his 3 questions. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would think about it. He called back in 2 days. He said yes. The location Robert Calloway had been considering was a property on the west side of Carterville, a 6-bay facility that had been sitting vacant for 8 months. Large enough for the kind of operation they were discussing, positioned on a corridor that had been growing steadily for 3 years. The build-out took 4 months. Calvin was involved in every decision, not loudly, not with the energy of a man who needed to be seen making decisions, but with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that the decisions made at the beginning were the ones you lived with at the end. He hired 6 people. One of them was Deshawn. He called Deshawn himself. He did not explain the full situation on the phone. He said he was opening a shop and that he was looking for someone who knew how to run parts and who understood the difference between a shop that served its customers and one that served itself. He said he had heard Deshawn was that kind of a person. Deshawn was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said, "When do you need me?" Calvin told him the start date. He told him the wage, which was 30% higher than what Pruitt's had been paying him. He told him one other thing, that the shop would operate on a simple principle, that every diagnosis would be documented, every recommendation would be explained, and that no service would be sold to a customer that was not directly related to what the customer had come in for. Deshawn said, "Yes, sir." He gave Pruitt's 2 weeks' notice the following morning. The shop opened on a Thursday in late spring, with no ceremony and no announcement beyond a sign on the building and a listing in the local business directory. Calvin had not called the press. He had not posted on social media. He had not made a speech. He had unlocked the door at 7 in the morning, put on a pot of coffee, and waited for the first car to pull in. It pulled in at 7:12. It was a 2009 Honda Accord with a rough idle and a check engine light that had been on for 6 weeks. The woman driving it had been told by 2 other shops that she needed a new catalytic converter. The estimate she had been given was $1,400. Calvin put the car on the lift, pulled the codes, traced the fault to an oxygen sensor that had failed and was producing a false reading, replaced the sensor for $62 in parts and 40 minutes of labor, and sent her home with a car that ran cleanly and a receipt that she read twice because she could not believe the number. She left a review that afternoon. She described what had happened in plain language, without drama, without the vocabulary of the internet. She said a man had looked at her car, found the real problem, fixed the real problem, and charged her for the real problem and nothing else. She said she had never had that experience at an auto shop before. She said she did not know what to do with it except tell people. People read it. People came. The shop did not become successful overnight. Nothing Calvin Reese had built had ever happened overnight. It grew the way the work had always grown for him, steadily, through repetition and precision and the particular trust that accumulates when people learn that a place will not lie to them. By the end of the first year, all 6 bays were full by 9 in the morning, and the wait list for appointments ran 2 weeks out. Patricia Osei, the regional director who had watched the video 3 times on a Wednesday afternoon, drove to Carterville in the shop's 4th month and introduced herself. She and Calvin spoke for an hour in the small office he kept at the back of the building, a room with no certificates on the wall and a single photograph of Estelle Reese on the desk, small and precise, her hair pinned back, her hands flat on a kitchen table. Patricia Osei asked Calvin if he had ever considered teaching. He said he had thought about it. She said the certification body she represented had been looking to develop a regional training program anchored by working practitioners, people who could demonstrate what they knew rather than simply describe it. She asked if he would be interested in a conversation about that. He said he would think about it. He called her back in 3 days. He said yes. And what happened to Dale Pruitt? That is a story that does not require much telling, because it told itself, the way these things do when the truth has already been made visible in a parking lot and recorded on a phone and seen by 3 million people. The video did not destroy Pruitt's auto service on its own. What it did was open a door that had always been there, and through that door came the things that had been waiting behind it. The Georgia Consumer Protection Division received 11 complaints about Pruitt's auto service in the 6 weeks following the video. Not all of them were new complaints. Several of them were from customers who had paid for services they had not needed and who had not known, until they saw the video and read the comments from mechanics who named what they were watching, that they had grounds to say so. The division opened a formal inquiry. The inquiry found a pattern. The pattern was documented. The documentation was thorough. Pruitt's license to operate was suspended pending review 4 months after the video was posted. The review took 6 weeks. At the conclusion of the review, the license was not reinstated. The conditions required for reinstatement included a complete audit of billing practices going back 3 years, restitution to affected customers, and a supervised operational restructuring that Dale Pruitt, facing the audit and the cost of the restitution and the weight of what the inquiry had found, determined he could not sustain. He closed the shop on a Friday afternoon in September. He did not make a statement. He did not call the press. He turned off the lights and locked the door, and the sign that had been there for 19 years stayed up for another 3 weeks before someone came to take it down. Gina had left 2 months before the closure. She had found a position at a dealership across town and had given her notice without drama, without a speech, with only the quiet efficiency of a person who had already decided. She did not speak publicly about what she had witnessed at the counter that morning. She did not need to. The video had already said it. The 6 bays at Pruitt's sat empty through the fall. Calvin Reese did not go back to the shop on Desire Street that fall. He did not need to. The shop on Desire Street existed inside him the way all true education exists, not as a memory of a place, but as a permanent alteration of the person who had been formed there. He carried Raymond's silence the way he carried the torque wrench, not as a tool he had borrowed, but as a thing that had become part of his hand. The training program he built with Patricia Osai opened the following spring in a converted classroom space adjacent to his Carterville location. It was not a large program. It was not designed to be large. It was designed to be exact. 12 students in the first cohort, selected not by grades or by prior certification, but by a practical assessment Calvin designed himself. A 2-hour exercise in which each applicant was given a car with an undisclosed fault and a set of hand tools and asked to find the problem. He did not tell them what he was looking for. He watched how they moved. He watched how they listened. He watched whether they reached for the tool before they had finished thinking. Of the 12 students in the first cohort, 9 completed the program and received certification. 3 of them were hired directly into the shop. One of them was a 19-year-old from Macon named Terrell, who had been told by a vocational counselor the year before that he did not have the aptitude for technical work. Terrell completed every assessment in the top 3. On the day he received his certificate, he did not make a speech. He shook Calvin's hand and said, "Thank you for not deciding before you looked." Calvin nodded. He recognized the grammar of that sentence. He had been speaking it his whole life. Estelle Reese was 81 years old by the time the shop in Carterville had been open for 2 years. She still lived on Desire Street. She still wore her hair pinned back. She still kept her opinions close, though she had more of them now and was less inclined to keep them entirely to herself. Calvin drove down to New Orleans on a Saturday in October, the way he had been driving down on Saturdays when he could manage it for the better part of his adult life. And he sat with her on the narrow porch, where the air smelled of the river and the neighbors' cooking, and the particular quality of light that belongs only to that part of the world in autumn. He told her about the shop. He told her about the training program. He told her about Terrell. He told her about the video, which she had not seen because she did not own a smartphone and did not intend to, and he told her about Dale Pruitt and about the parking lot and about what he had done there and why. Estelle listened to all of it with her hands flat on the arms of her chair, the way she had always listened, as if the listening were itself a form of work. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you fix the car?" He said he had. She said, "That's the story, then." She did not say anything else about it. She looked out at the street. After a while, she said, "You hungry?" He said he was. She got up and went inside, and the screen door closed behind her with the same sound it had made for 40 years. He sat on the porch for a moment longer. The street was quiet in the October afternoon. He could hear her moving in the kitchen. He thought about Raymond, who had been gone for 6 years now, and about the torque wrench, and about the way knowledge passes from one person to another, not through certificates or classrooms, but through the patient repetition of doing a thing correctly in front of someone who is paying attention. He thought about Deshawn, who was now the shop's parts and inventory manager, a title that did not begin to describe what Deshawn actually did, which was to function as the connective tissue of the place, the person who knew where everything was and who needed what and when, who understood the rhythm of the bass the way a musician understands the rhythm of a room. Deshawn had not been given the promotion because Calvin owed him a debt. He had been given it because he had demonstrated, every day since the shop opened, that he was exactly the person Calvin had believed him to be when he handed a stranger a breaker bar in a parking lot and stayed. Robert Calloway had attended the ribbon cutting for the training program. He had stood in the back of the room and not made a speech because Calvin had not asked him to make a speech, and Robert Calloway was a man who understood the difference between occasions that required him and occasions that did not. He had shaken Calvin's hand afterward and said, "I should have found you 10 years ago." Calvin had said, "You found me when you needed to." That was all. They had both understood it to be sufficient. Patricia Osei had been in the front row. She had brought 2 colleagues from the certification body's national office, who had driven up from Atlanta and who had spent an hour after the program talking to Calvin about the possibility of replicating the model in other markets. Calvin had listened to them carefully. He had asked 4 questions. He had said he would think about it. He had not called them back yet, but he would. He always did. The question that remained, the one that the video had not answered, and that the inquiry had not answered, and that the closure of Pruitt's had not answered, was the one that lives inside every story like this one. Not what happened to the man who was wronged, not what happened to the man who wronged him, but what it means that it happened at all, what it means that the waiting room went quiet and nobody moved, what it means that a man had to fix his own car in a parking lot to prove that he knew what he was talking about, what it means that 3 million people watched a video of a man doing his job and called it extraordinary, when the only extraordinary thing about it was that he had been told, in front of witnesses, that he would not know the difference. He knew the difference. He had always known the difference. He had known it since he was 11 years old with a torque wrench in his hand in a one-bay shop off Claiborne Avenue, and he had known it through every certification and every rebuild and every year of work that he had done without announcing it, without framing it, without asking anyone to see it. The knowledge was not the extraordinary thing. The knowledge was simply the knowledge. What was extraordinary was how thoroughly the world had been prepared to disbelieve it. This happens every day. Not in every parking lot, not always with a video to record it, but in waiting rooms and boardrooms and service counters and hiring offices and classrooms and all the ordinary places where a person walks in carrying everything they have built and is looked at by someone who has already decided what they are. And the decision is made before the first word is spoken, and the decision is wrong, and the cost of the decision is paid by the person who was decided about, quietly, without recourse, without a parking lot and a canvas tool roll and 47 minutes of footage to prove what should never have needed proven. Calvin Reese did not fix his car in that parking lot to make a point. He fixed it because it needed fixing and because he knew how to fix it. The point was already there. It had been there for 22 years. He simply did the work, the way Estelle had taught him, the way Raymond had shown him, the way every hour of invisible labor had prepared him to do. And the work said everything that needed saying. Stay low. Build high. The ones who shout from the bottom never reach the top. He had not shouted. He had never shouted. He had simply been exactly what he was, in plain sight, in a parking lot, on a Tuesday morning in Carterville, Georgia, and the world had taken 3 million views to catch up. Now, I want to ask you something. Because this story is not really about a parking lot or a video or a man named Dale Pruitt who lost everything he had built his name on. It is about what we decide before we look. It is about the knowledge that gets dismissed before it speaks, and the dignity that holds steady when it would be easier and more understandable and entirely human to break. Think about someone in your life or in your own experience who was dismissed before they were understood. Think about what that costs them. Think about what it costs the person who dismissed them. Drop a comment and tell me about it. I want to hear it. The specific stories, the ones that happened in waiting rooms and parking lots and ordinary Tuesday mornings, those are the ones that matter most. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about the people the world overlooked and what they built in the silence of that overlooking, subscribe. We find them every week. We will keep finding them, because they are everywhere and they deserve to be seen.